Vilrain Mall was on item 4 of the list when the laughter in the lantern hall reached the chandeliers, and she had written the list specifically so that the laughter would reach the chandeliers, so she allowed herself one measured breath of satisfaction and kept reading. Item 4, she said, holding the cream-colored sheet at the precise angle that let the gallery see its official seal, the seal of the keeper of the calendar, her seal, pressed in dark green wax as though the document were a treaty and not a joke. The Pavilion of the Held Breath has drafted a protocol annex for the Accord of the Two Shores. It is unpublished. It is guarded. The aide will obtain it, bound, and place it on my desk. The gallery of the Atelier of the 100 Courtesies, 400 of the most polished beings in known space, curators and under-curators, and etiquette masters and guests, who had paid in favors for the privilege of standing under these particular chandeliers, on the opening night of the season, made the sound that polished beings make instead of howling, a ripple. A shimmer of amusement passing through silk and scale and feather cloak, glasses lifted to hide mouths, mouths not hiding much. Somewhere near the third pillar, a Murex consul actually clicked his shell plates, which among the Murex is the equivalent of pounding the table. Vilrain's collar stayed the color of slate. Vessery of her line trained the candor out of their skin before they trained anything else. A chief of staff whose collar flushed every shade of her feelings would last a single season on the spur. Hers had not betrayed her in 11 years. She lowered the sheet a fraction and looked out over the hall, the long terraced room with its 100 doors and its 1,000 lanterns, and she located the human. The human was easy to locate. The human was the only being in the lantern hall wearing a uniform that had been issued rather than commissioned. Naya Caro stood at the foot of the lower stair where second aide stood, hands folded, 23 years old by the file, hired 4 weeks ago under the Charter of Open Service that the curators had signed because it photographed well, and assigned because no one could think what else to do with a human, to Vilrain's own staff. She was watching the reading of her own list with the expression of a passenger watching weather. Not blank, attentive, just unbothered. In a way Vilrain had decided on first meeting was a species-wide failure to understand where they were. Tonight the list would teach her where she was. Item 5, Vilrain read. The Brel creditor syndics and the Ama choir lords will share one table, one dinner, with no incident worthy of a single line in any etiquette master's report. A handsome groan rolled through the gallery. Everyone in the room had survived at least one evening of Brel and Ama in adjacent rooms, let alone adjacent chairs. Under-curator Mayville, 3 steps up the terrace, called out, "Shall we notify the surgeons now or after?" and got his laugh, and then, flushed with it, called the season's epitaph over the rail at the human directly. "Be kind, keeper, she'll quit by dawn," and got the bigger laugh, and Vilrain permitted that too, because a list read aloud is a performance and a performance needs its chorus. This was the right, after all. Every season since before Vilrain's hatching, the Atelier had welcomed its newest aides with a list of courtesies. 11 items. Impossible by design. The aides were not expected to complete them. They were expected to understand by morning the distance between themselves and the institution they had presumed to join, and the clever ones were expected to fail gracefully, which was its own kind of audition. Vilrain had received her own list 20 years ago in a cold underoffice with no audience at all, from a chief of staff who had not even troubled to watch her read it. She had completed none of the 11. She had also not slept for 4 days trying, which she understood much later had been the entire point. She had never before read a list aloud at the Lantern Ledger. But then, the Atelier had never before been required to hire a human, and the season had never before opened with the guild's survival on the table, and when the great houses are nervous, they like their comedy administered publicly, the way the Chorad liked their executions. The Accord of the Two Shores had been announced not an hour ago from this same dais. The Commission of the Generation, the peace signing between the Racine Tide Courts and the Chorad Ember clans, 60 years of straight war to be ended on the Atelier's floor in 50 days, and every being under the chandeliers knew the guild had lost the last 3 great commissions to the pavilion, and that this one had come to them old and difficult and politically radioactive, because the pavilion had not wanted it. The Atelier was being handed a chance to die in public, so they laughed hard tonight. Frightened institutions always do. Item 6, Vilrain read. For the mingling of waters, an anthem will be sung in Old Shore speak. The aide will produce a singer. I am told the language has been dead for 60 years. I am confident this presents no difficulty. Item 7. 600 place settings for the Accord banquet have been etched with an incorrect honorific. They will be correct by closing day at no cost to this house. Item 8. The Chorad delegation will be led by the cindered envoy. No tailor on Miravel's spur holds a pattern for his body. He will require a signing robe. It will fit. She read them in her flattest registry voice. The voice she used for budget recitations and the flatness was the joke, and the gallery loved her for it. Even the etiquette masters were laughing now, the old ones. The ones who had buried more careers than the void itself. Maviel had given up on wit and was simply wheezing, it should be said, and Velrain would spend a long time later deciding exactly when she had first refused to say it to herself that every item on the list was real. That was her innovation. That was, she had thought, the elegance. The traditional lists were stuffed with poetic impossibilities. Bottle a comet's tail, return yesterday's tide. Velrain had no patience for poetry. She had simply opened the Accord's working folder, the true folder, the one her own deputies called the drowned folder, because every problem in it had been declared unsolvable by at least 2 departments, and she had copied out its 11 worst pages, and she had dressed them as a hazing. If the human drowned, the guild lost nothing. The items were already drowned. There had seemed to be a tidy cruelty in that, a thrift, and the atelier had always prized thrift in its cruelties. They kept better that way. Item 9, she read. 1,100 weight of Koret ember salt sits in bond at the Vellum port office, which closed yesterday for the counting, and will not open for 40 days. The banquet requires the salt in 12. The aid will resolve this with the port authorities, who have not answered a guild petition during the counting in 900 years. Item 10. Velrain paused on item 10. She had debated item 10 with herself for the better part of an evening, and had kept it, because a list of courtesies traditionally carried one item whose impossibility was not logistical, and because some part of her, she would examine this part extensively later, with a particular thoroughness she otherwise reserved for enemies, had wanted to see the first curator's face when it was read. Item 10. Curator Emerita Aloth Vaughn will attend the Accord and sit the witness chair. The laughter did not ripple this time. It dropped a register, went smoky, became the laughter beings produce when something is funny because it is forbidden. 400 faces performed not glancing at the dais' north end, where first curator Ezeltha Vaughn stood with her hands folded inside her sleeves, 90 years old, silver to the eyes. Everyone on the spur knew the shape of the story, even if they had the details wrong. The elder sister, who had been the greatest curator of her generation and had walked out of the guild 30 years ago and had not spoken to the younger since. Asking the human to fetch her was like asking the human to fetch the guild's own buried heart. Ezelthi's expression did not change. Her eyes found Velrain's for the duration of one lantern flicker, and Velrain's collar held slate by force of training alone, and then the first curator looked away, politely, as one looks away from a colleague's stumble. Worth it, Velrain decided. Probably. And item 11. She let the sheet fall against her thigh and delivered the last one from memory to the room, with the smallest permissible bow toward the foot of the lower stair. All 10 of the above will be accomplished without the aid being seen to accomplish anything. The atelier of the 100 courtesies does not scurry. Whatever this house achieves, it achieves invisibly, and its aids most of all. Welcome, Aid Caro, to the lower stair. The hall came apart, fondly, terribly. The chandeliers rang with it. Somebody began applauding in the antique style, palm against shoulder, and the gallery took it up in waves, applauding the list, applauding Velrain, applauding 60 years of certainty that the universe was arranged in terraces and everyone was standing on the right one. A Tessic dowager near the dais was repeating the witness chair, and dabbing at her eyes with a sleeve. The Murex consul had achieved a full carapace rattle. Velrain folded the list with 2 creases exactly and looked down the length of the lantern hall at the human, expecting, what? Tears would have been gauche but acceptable. Anger would have been better. Anger photographed badly and resigned within a season. Most likely was the human stillness she had already catalogued, the weather watching, which would do, because 40 days of this room's mockery would weather anyone. The human was not looking at her. The human was looking, with mild professional attention, at the south doors where the night porter Oth had just come through carrying a tray. It was the curator's tray, the black lacquer, the rim of river gold, the small ceremonial kettle that lived behind 3 locks in the under kitchen and produced, once heated, exactly 1 pour of what the guild called first steam, the founding draught, the cup that only curators tasted, and only on nights of consequence. The gala's last lantern was guttering in its ring above the dais. By charter older than the chandeliers, the first curator drank first steam as it died. 400 beings had seen the tray 100 times. 400 beings made way for it without thinking, still laughing, still applauding, an avenue of silk opening through the hall by pure institutional reflex, which is why it took the gallery so long to notice that the tray was not going to the first curator. Oth, stone-skinned slow, 40 years on the night doors and never once looked at directly by anyone in this room, walked his measured porter's walk past the dais, past Ezeltha Vaughn, past Velrain, and set the tray down on the small duty table at the foot of the lower stair, beside the human. On the tray, beside the kettle, sat a second cup, a plain one. Steam stood up off it in a thin, unhurried line. The applause did not stop so much as lose its way. Naya Caro picked up the plain cup, carried it up the length of the hall through the avenue of silk that had been opened for somebody else entirely, and set it hot at Velrana Strevmal's elbow. Then she took one step back, folded her hands, and said, in a voice that carried no further than it had to, "Item 1, keeper. First steam of the curator's kettle, served hot at the last lantern. I wasn't sure you'd want it read out twice, so I had it poured while you read." Velrain looked at the cup. The hall looked at the cup. The cup steamed. Somewhere very high up, the last lantern chose that moment to go out. Schedule, the way everything in the atelier went out and came on and proceeded on schedule. And in the particular quality of dimness that followed, Velrain heard the laughter try to come back. Maviel got half a syllable out, and failed, defeated not by outrage but by arithmetic, because 400 polished minds were all performing the same calculation at the same time. The list had been a secret until it was read. The reading had begun 12 minutes ago. The kettle lived behind 3 locks. Therefore, item 1, Velrain heard herself say, was a figure of speech. "Yes, keeper," the human said. "It came out very well for a figure of speech." She bowed, to the dais, not to the gallery, the correct depth for a second aid, executed without flourish, and walked back down the hall to the foot of the lower stair, and took up her station, hands folded, and resumed watching the room like weather. The room, for its part, had entirely stopped being able to watch anything else. Velrain did not touch the cup. She would think about that too later, that her first decision of the season, made in front of 400 witnesses with her collar-locked slate, had been to leave the proof standing at her elbow rather than admit her hand might not be steady enough to lift it. The first curator drank her own first steam 2 minutes later, when the duty steward arrived with the proper tray and an expression of a being who has just lost an argument in the under kitchen and cannot say so. As Vaughan raised a founding draft to the dead lantern, and to the accord, and to the season, and the gallery drank with her, and the gala closed in good order, and everyone said, "What a triumph, what a list, what an evening." But walking out under the 100 doors, the polished beings of the spur were not quoting items 4 through 10. They were asking one another, in the bright, brittle voices of people who have been laughing all night and have just run out of the reason, a much smaller question. How did she get the kettle? Velrain found out at dawn, because she had been awake all night finding out, which she filed under diligence rather than under what it was. The answer was on one page, and the page made it worse. There had been no theft. There had been no charm, no bribery, no conspiracy of porters. There was a duty roster. The last lantern service, the carrying of the curator's tray, the gravest small office in the house, rotated among senior stewards by a roster posted in the under kitchen, and the roster for the lantern ledger had carried for 11 days a blank line, because the gala fell on the night of the counting, and every steward senior enough for the office had bought themselves off the duty to attend their own observances. An empty line on a charter duty was a quiet scandal nobody had reported up, because reporting it up meant owning it. And 4 weeks ago, a new second aide, working through her orientation papers, actually working through them, initialing each page, the way no hire of any species had done in living memory, had reached the Charter of Open Service, Appendix 6, the service schedule, found that any aide of the House in good standing could volunteer for any unclaimed charter duty and sign the blank line at noon, 8 hours before the list existed. Velrain sat with that for a while. The human had not outmaneuvered her. The human had been standing lawfully with a kettle inside an arrangement Velrain had not known existed. Hours before, Velrain had drafted the document meant to bury her, and when the document arrived, she had simply noticed that one of its items described the duty she was already performing, and performed it. It was luck, Velrain decided, with the part of her mind that drafted official memoranda. The other part of her mind, the part that had clawed up the lower stair itself once, observed quietly that luck did not initial appendices, and was told to be silent. She volunteered for the counting night roster, said Underkeeper Selvach, when Velrain convened her deputies at the second bell, which means she also volunteered for the rest of the counting fortnight. Nobody volunteers for the counting fortnight. The porters are calling her. Selvach consulted his slate, a being of great precision. They appear to be calling her by her name, Keeper, which I note because I had to ask 3 of them what the human was called, and all 3 knew, and none of them know mine. Fascinating. Velrain said in the tone that closed topics, "The list will proceed. Item 2 is already in motion by its own weight. The Tide Mother's gift, vessel." Here was the shape of item 2 and the reason it had gone on the list. The Racine Tide Courts would bring to the accord their ancestral mingling vessel, the carved basin into which the waters of the two shores would be poured at the signing. It had been shipped ahead, and it had arrived cracked. Hairline, but to the Racine a flawed vessel at a treaty table was not an embarrassment, it was an omen, and 60 years of war had been restarted twice on omens. The crack could be healed only by recarving the rim, a day's work for a master stonewright. There was exactly one stonewright on Mirabelle Spur whom the tide courts would accept. Master Holland, guild-licensed, reef-trained, beloved. And Master Holland's bondmate had died 8 days ago, and Holland had entered mourning seclusion, 30 days behind the grief lamp, by custom older than the guild, and the Racine themselves would sooner recrack the vessel than ask a mourner to take up tools for hire. 2 departments had declared it closed. The drowned folder had a black ribbon on the page. "The vessel will be raised with the morning freight," Selvach said. "Conservation will photograph the crack for the record of our," he chose the word with care, "undertaking. Of our commission," Vilrain said. "We have 50 days, go." She did not assign item 2 to anyone. That was the architecture of the list. The items were the aids to fail, and the failures would accrue to the aid, and in 40 days the guild would quietly resolve what it could the ordinary way, behind the comedy, as it always had. She spent the day on the Accord's true calendar, security protocols with the station wardens, the dietary matrix, the delegation's arrival order, which was itself a small war, and did not think about the human more than some number of times which she did not count, because counting it would have been data. On the 3rd morning after the gala, the mingling vessel came back up to the protocol floor in its padded crate, and conservation unpacked it for the damage record, and the crack was gone. The rim flowed unbroken, recarved a half-finger deeper in a wave pattern that matched the original strokes so exactly that conservation's lensmaster checked twice for substitution before he found, worked into the underside in the formal reef script, the stonewright's own mark, Holland's mark, and a date 2 days old, and one further line of small chisel work that the lensmaster translated aloud to the protocol floor before he quite realized what he was reading out and what it would do. For the lampkeeper, the line said, "Grief hours, no fee." Vilrain had the relevant custom researched within the hour, by 3 archivists working separately, because she did not believe the first report. The custom was real and unimpeachably old. A mourner in seclusion may take no commission, accept no fee, and serve no patron. But a mourner whose grief lamp is kept by another, whose vigil is shared through the dark hours by a companion who tends the flame and listens to the stories of the dead, may do lamp work, unpaid work, gift work, work done to keep the hands living while the heart is not. Lamp work is not a breach of seclusion. Lamp work is its medicine. There was case custom going back 6 centuries. The Racine consulate asked delicately, replied that to be served by a vessel healed as lamp work was not merely acceptable but auspicious beyond purchase, and inquired, less delicately, who the lamp keeper had been, because the tide mother would wish to know. 3 nights. The human had worked her duty rosters until the last bell, walked down to the stonewrights' row, and sat the lamp in Master Holland's outer room for 3 nights running. There was no record of it anywhere, except the lamp oil ledger of the mourner's chandlery, which Vilrain was slightly horrified to find herself reading at midnight, and which recorded only, oil, 3 measures, signed N. Caro, and somewhere in the 3rd night, the stories of the dead having been listened to, the old stonewright had stood up, lit his workroom, and healed the tide court's omen for the cost of nothing at all. The atelier's ledger entry for item 2, the entry Vilrain wrote herself because she could not decide which deputy she was willing to have see it, read, "Vessel restored, outlay nil, method, courtesy." She sat looking at the word courtesy for some time. Then she did the thing she would also examine later, the first small load-bearing dishonesty. She initialed the page, filed it under routine conservation, and mentioned it to no one. And the spur being the spur, by the next evening everyone, from the dock clerks to the pavilion's listening posts, knew every detail anyway, knew it with ornaments on it, and in the guild's own gallery the joke had begun very quietly to change owners. Maviel told it at the week's reception, the kettle and the lamp both, doing the voices, the wasn't sure you'd want it read out twice, and got his laugh, the same ripple, the same shimmer of silk. But Vilrain, standing at the edge of it with her collar slate, heard the difference even if Maviel couldn't. 5 nights ago the room had been laughing at the distance between a human and the atelier of the 100 courtesies. Now it was laughing at the suspicion, not yet a fear, that the distance might be measured from the wrong end. The fear arrived 11 days later, wearing 43 white flowers. It had been a bad 11 days for reasons that had nothing to do with the human or so, Vilrain told herself in the mornings, when telling herself things still worked. The 2 shores had jointly informed the atelier, jointly the first thing the murderous old enemies had agreed on in 60 years, that the Accord's date would move forward. The Racine succession courts were circling the Tide Mother. The Korad clans had a famine moon coming. Both shores wanted the peace signed before their own houses could unsign it. 50 days had become 31. The announcement had landed on the protocol floor like a dropped chandelier, and Velrain had spent 4 days rebuilding the calendar around the wreckage, and the drowned folder had grown 3 new pages, and somewhere in the middle of it, the pavilion of the held breath had issued a public statement wishing its sibling guild all possible fortune with. A task of such weight, on such a calendar, which on the spur was the equivalent of sending a wreath in advance. So Velrain had not been thinking about item 3. Nobody serious could be thinking about item 3. Item 3 was 40 stems of white salt blossom, the Racine treaty flower, the bloom of stilled water, required by the Tide Mother's own protocol office to dress the signing table, and salt blossom was out of season on the reef worlds, and exporting it out of season was banned under conservation covenants the Racine themselves had written, and the covenants had no diplomatic exemption, because the last Racine official to grant one had been fed to a current. The Tide Courts' protocol office knew all this and had specified the flower anyway, 60 years of war having taught both shores the diplomatic value of demanding the impossible and watching what the other party did about it. The drowned folder's recommendation, drafted by Velrain's own hand, was a substitution of silk replicas with a formal apology. The protocol, equivalent of opening the signing by admitting defeat. On the 12th morning, Velrain came up the great stair into the protocol floor and found the long table dressed. 43 stems of white salt blossom stood in water-glass cylinders down the table's spine, real, alive, absurd, their petals doing the thing that made the flower famous, the slow-breathing fold and open that reef poets had been embarrassing themselves over for centuries. Conservation was orbiting the table at a respectful distance with instruments. 2 Racine consular clerks were standing very still by the doors, holding each other's wrists. 43, said Selvach, materializing at her shoulder with his slate already raised, because 11 days had taught the deputies a new reflex. 40 required, 3 spare against bruising. No export documentation, keeper, because, and she heard him take the breath, the now characteristic breath her whole senior staff had developed, the breath that meant the explanation would be worse than the mystery, because they were never exported. They were grown here, on the north roof, in the brine troughs. The north roof, Velrain said, does not have brine troughs. The north roof has had brine troughs for 41 years, keeper, under the coolant outfall housings. They were built for the first armistice. The guild grew the treaty flowers on station for the armistice table. It's in the old works ledger, one line. Never decommissioned because decommissioning required a curator's signature, and the curator in question had, the breath again, left the guild. The planting went feral against the warm outfall. It's been flowering up there every cycle for 4 decades. Gardening knew. Gardening has always known. Nobody ever asked gardening. And the human asked gardening. The human, Selvach said, consulting the slate as though the next part required certification, has eaten her midday meal in the gardener's bothy every day since her hiring. The undergardeners state that she asks questions about the roofs. The head gardener, some keeper, he's been here longer than the chandeliers, states, and I am quoting the statement he gave because I believe its syntax is load-bearing. She asked what the roof used to be. People only ever ask what it is. Velrain stood looking at the breathing flowers, what she felt and catalogued herself feeling, with the small cold accuracy that was either her great professional gift or the disease she had mistaken for one, was not admiration and not anger. It was the sensation of a floor being recounted under her feet, the specific vertigo of learning that the building she ran, the building she could navigate blind, the building whose every protocol she could recite backward, contained rooms she had never been told about, and that the doors to those rooms opened for a 4-week hire, because the 4-week hire ate lunch with gardeners. The Racine consulate sent a formal note that afternoon observing that flowers grown in atelier brine from armistice stock carried, in the Tide Courts' eyes, a continuity of omen no imported stem could have matched, and that the Tide Mother had been informed and was pleased. The note used the auspicious word again. It was the second time in 11 days that the word auspicious had attached itself to the lower stair, and the spur's broadsheets, which could smell a pattern through a sealed hull, had begun to attach it to other things, to the accord, to the staggering calendar, and once, in a gossip column deniably ruinously to a certain unranked member of the host guild staff, of a species the spur had previously valued chiefly as a punchline, which was the state of the board when Velrain, against the advice of the part of her mind that drafted memoranda, decided to force item 4. She told herself it was housekeeping. The list was public property now. The gallery recited its items at receptions the way one hums a season's fashionable tune. Leaving the remaining items to drift was untidy. But item 4 was not housekeeping, and she knew it. Item 4 was the pavilion's unpublished protocol annex for the Accord, the rival guild's private playbook for the summit it had declined to host, the document in which the pavilion's masters would have wargamed every seating, every gift, every catastrophe, and knowing Savish Drell, every way a catastrophe might be encouraged from the outside. Obtaining it was not an errand. It was espionage, or it was impossible, and either outcome suited the institution fine. The human would fail publicly, or she would cross a line the atelier could disown her over, and the season would be rebalanced, and the laughter would come home. Velrain summoned the human to the keeper's office to say one sentence. Item 4 has a deadline now. The annex on my desk before the delegations. Land. She had prepared the sentence's temperature carefully. The human said, "It's been filed for since the 5th bell, keeper. Filed for. Under the courtesy of mirrors." And then, because Velrain's silence had a texture even species without chromatophores could apparently read, the common charter, keeper, the one both guilds descend from. Article the 9th, any signatory house may request from a sibling house its protocol, writings on any shared commission for harmonization of courtesies, and the request must be honored within 3 days, or the refusing house forfeits precedence at the next common table. It's never been used. I think because using it means saying out loud that you need to see someone else's work. You filed a charter instrument that has lain dead for. Velrain performed the arithmetic and disliked it longer than the war we are ending. In whose name? This house cannot be seen to in mine, the human said. Second aid, lower stair, requesting writings for harmonization. The atelier hasn't asked the pavilion for anything. A junior clerk did some filing. A pause, the precise length of a held breath. If it's refused, a junior clerk got above herself, and you may discipline me at your convenience. If it's honored, the pavilion of the held breath spent 3 days deciding it was legally obliged to do an errand for a human. Velrain sat quite still behind her desk, her collar slate, her thoughts not slate at all, examining the construction the way a stonewright examines a join. The exposure was entirely the aids. The benefit was entirely the houses. The trap, and it was a trap, was entirely the pavilion's. Comply and be ridiculous. Refuse and forfeit precedence at the common table in front of every guild on the spur. In the very season, the pavilion was campaigning to be seen as the natural heir to the atelier's standing. Drell would see the jaws of it the moment the filing crossed his desk. Drell would also see, as Velrain was seeing, that there was no third option because the instrument was charter clean, and the pavilion's whole public argument for its own ascendancy was that it honored the old forms better than its decaying sibling. You understood all of that, Velrain said, from orientation papers. From the appendices, the human said. Most things are in the appendices. On the 3rd day, within the final hour of the deadline, the protocol annex of the Pavilion of the Held Breath arrived at the atelier's clerk's gate, bound in the pavilion's gray silk, addressed in Savish Drell's own elegant hand to second aid in. Caro, lower stair, with a ribbon card reading, "May the harmonization of courtesies bring our houses ever closer, and the entire spur, every guild, every consulate, every broadsheet, every dock clerk, understood precisely what had happened, and to whom, and by means of what." Maviel did not tell that one at the week's reception. Nobody did. The gallery had discovered that the list it had spent a season reciting as comedy was being worked through, in order, in public, by its punchline, and that the audience for the joke had quietly become the joke's subject matter. 4 items in 25 days. The laughter in the lantern hall did not stop, exactly. It thinned. It developed the careful quality of beings who suspect the acoustics may carry, and the accord rolled toward them all like a tide with a date on it. Velrain worked. Whatever else was shifting in the house, the calendar was hers, and the calendar in those weeks would have broken a lesser keeper. 31 days had become 26. The Court advance party landed and immediately objected to the orientation of the guest wing's doors. Clan doors faced the mother fire, and the wing's doors faced the void side promenade, and the wing could not be rotated, so the mother fire would have to be established on the promenade, which the station wardens called a fire hazard because it was one, being a fire. The Racine advance party landed and presented a security annex demanding, among 91 stipulations, that no standing water be visible in any chamber the Tide Mother entered. Still water being ambush water, the oldest reef fear. The thing 60 years of straight war had been fought with and around, and the atelier's grand vestibule was built around a reflecting pool that had been the architectural signature of the house for 3 centuries. Drain it, Velrain ruled, and facilities looked at her the way deputies look when the ruling is correct and the explanation to the gallery will not be. And the gallery duly mourned the pool as though it were a curator, and the broadsheets ran the story under headlines about the host guild bailing, water, and the pavilion's friends dined out on it for a week. Vilrain absorbed it. That was the work. The work was making 1,000 correct rulings that each cost a little blood and would never be itemized by anyone, while the drowned folder sat on her desk, holding the 7 rulings that could not be made because they were impossible. Item 5 came due on the 26th evening before the accord, and it came due in fire. The dinner of the creditors had been on no one's social calendar because no sane house would convene it, and then the Brel made it unavoidable. The Brel creditor syndics held paper on both shores, 60 years of war debt, fleets mortgaged, harvests pledged, and the syndics had communicated, through channels only technically deniable, that unless they were honored with a place in the accord's social order commensurate with their position, questions of debt standstill might regrettably surface during the signing week. The Ama choir lords, hereditary guarantors of the Strait's old neutral shipping lanes, had communicated the same in the opposite key. Both parties had to be fed, honored, and flattered before the delegation's formal arrival. Neither would accept a lesser table than the other, and Brel and Ama could not share a table, had not shared one in 9 decades because of the incident of the long toast, the details of which every etiquette master knew by heart and none would speak aloud. The drowned folder's page on the matter ended with a recommendation Vilrain had signed herself: 2 dinners, 2 nights, identical menus, and a season of managing the fury of whichever party learned it had been fed second. Cost enormous, risk certain, alternatives none. The human asked to see the dining room ceiling. Vilrain was present for this, because by the 26th evening before the accord, she had stopped pretending to her own diary that she delegated the list's items and begun attending them with the stated purpose of supervising the aide's exposure of the house and the actual purpose, which her diary did not receive, of watching the thing happen. The thing this time took place in the hall of the long table at the dead hour of the afternoon, the human standing on the table itself in her stocking feet. Maviel, who had come to sneer, made a noise like a struck glass when she stepped up onto the ancient wood and was ignored, turning slowly, clapping her hands once at intervals and listening to the room with her eyes shut. The incident of the long toast, she said, from the table, eyes still shut, to no one in particular, 90 years ago. The Ama choir lord rose to sing the honor verse, and the Brel senior syndic's acknowledgement clicks came back off the old dome, louder than the singing, and the Ama heard it as deliberate drowning, and the Brel heard the Ama's protest pitch as a curse tone, and it went from there. Everyone's written about who insulted whom. She opened her eyes. Nobody's written about the dome. It was the dome. Brel's speech carries rank and volume. Ama's speech carries rank and pitch. You put both under one resonant ceiling, and the room itself lies to everyone in it about everyone else's intentions in both languages at once. They didn't fight because they hate each other. They fought because the architecture slandered them. The hall of the long table had, at its east end, the famous coffered dome. At its west end, a flat low ceiling of acoustic blackwood, installed 2 centuries ago to spare a tone-deaf first curator the echo of his own toasts. Another room Vilrain had not known her building contained, although she had dined under it some thousands of times. The human seated the Brel under the blackwood, where their volume fell dead and flat, and every click arrived at every earstalk exactly as ranked. She seated the Ama under the dome, where their pitches bloomed and carried and rang. She set the table itself on the long diagonal so that neither party sat above the other in any direction a protocol compass could be applied to. The etiquette masters spent 2 days with their instruments confirming the diagonal's perfect neutrality. 2 days at the end of which the eldest of them, a being who had not been observed to praise anything since the previous reign, pronounced the arrangement obvious. Which among etiquette masters is the highest word there is? And at the join of the 2 acoustics, at the room's exact dead spot, she placed the toastmaster's stand. So every formal word spoken that evening passed through the one point where the architecture could not editorialize. The dinner of the creditors ran 4 hours. The Brel syndics and the Ama choir lords toasted one another 11 times. The etiquette master's report on incidents ran to 1 line, and the line read, "None observed. See appendix on the diagonal." Vilrain read the report alone. At midnight, at the desk where 11 years of her life had been filed in correct order, and then she unlocked the lower left drawer, took out a fresh ledger of the small private kind, and wrote at the head of its first page, in her own hand, in no official capacity, words she took some time choosing. Item 1, a duty roster read where none of us read. Item 2, 3 nights of lamp oil. Item 3, a question to a gardener, what did this used to be? Item 4, an instrument we forgot we'd signed. Item 5, a ceiling we forgot we'd built. She looked at the 5 lines a long while, and beneath them she wrote the 6th line, the true entry, the one the whole season would keep asking her to read aloud, and the one she would keep locking in the drawer. She is not finding things we lost. She is finding things we never troubled to know we had. The inventory of this house is wrong, and she is the discrepancy. Her collar, alone at midnight with no one to see it, was not slate at all. The house noticed before she admitted noticing. Houses always do. It happened in small grammatical shifts, the kind that never appear in minutes. A wing steward with a scheduling collision stopped saying, "I'll raise it with the keeper's office," and started saying, "I'll leave it at the landing desk." The landing desk being the scuffed half table on the lower stairs first landing where the human did her paperwork, there being no office for second aides. The station wardens, who held the atelier's security perimeter and despised every being inside it equally, began addressing their daily liaison queries to the Caro desk as though it were a department. The Corrid advance party's quartermaster, a scarred clan uncle who had reduced 2 senior protocol officers to incoherence over the mother fire, was discovered drinking smoked tea at the gardener's bothy and describing to the human, in technical detail, exactly what his delegation's fire wardens would and would not tolerate, because, he said afterward perfectly audibly, in the vestibule, "She writes down what I say and not what she plans to tell me," I said. Velrain read the liaison logs each evening and watched the grammar move. 11 years she had spent making herself the room every problem walked into. Now there was a second room. It had no rank, no budget, no door, and a queue. Selvach said it first, because Selvach's particular gift was saying the unsayable in a tone that suggested he was reading it off a form. It was the 19th day before the accord. The agenda had 30 items. Item 12 had stalled on a question about Racine Tide Protocol nobody present could answer. "Ask the human," Selvach said. "Not. Perhaps the aide might be consulted." "Not. I believe Aide Caro has some familiarity." "Ask the human 3 words, flat, procedural, the way one says check the ledger." The senior staff of the Atelier of the 100 Courtesies, 11 beings with 4 centuries of accumulated precedence among them, looked at the words sitting in the middle of the table, and nobody laughed, and nobody objected. And after a moment, the wing steward de Velrain's left made a small note, and the agenda moved to item 13. That was all. That was everything. Institutions do not announce their hinges. They oil them quietly and pretend they were always there. Velrain went back to her office and added a line to the private ledger. Today the senior table said, "Ask the human," and what it meant was consult the authority. None of them heard it. I heard it. And then, because the ledger was private and midnight was midnight, I have begun to keep this record the way one keeps a record of weather before a storm one has decided not to mention to the passengers. Item 6 surfaced 2 days later, and it surfaced singing. The mingling of waters, the accord's central rite, the pouring of the 2 shores into Holland's healed vessel, required the anthem of the old strait sung in old shore speak. The pigeon of the ferry crossings, the working tongue the 2 shores had shared before the war made sharing treasonous. Both delegations had specified it. Each privately believed the requirement would humiliate the other. 60 years of weaponized impossibility, again, because the language was dead, not endangered, dead. The last certified speaker had died 11 years ago. The archives held texts and 1 corroded wire recording. The anthem's tide stops, the glottal catch that shore speak placed where the tide would turn, the thing that made it a language of ferrymen and not a code, could not be learned from paper, and every scholar consulted had said so in writing, with citations, with what Velrain had come to recognize as the academic version of relief. Velrain had assigned the item in the drowned folder, the only annotation that had ever felt honest. This one is actually impossible. She was in the East Gallery when she learned otherwise, reviewing lantern placements, and what she heard first was rhythm, a deep, patient, 4-beat pulse coming up through the service stair, cloth muffled accompanied by steam. She had passed the laundry landing perhaps 10,000 times in her career. She had never once gone down the stair. She went down the stair. The atelier's laundry was a cathedral she did not know her house contained, vaulted, white-tiled, ancient, fogged with mangle steam, and across it, working the long folding tables in rows, were the laundresses of the house. Hired women mostly, broad-handed, generations of them, and they were singing as they worked, as they had apparently sung every working day for 60 years and more, a call-and-answer cadence song that put the fold on the strong beat and the shake-out on the weak, and the song had tide stops in it. The human was sitting on an upturned soap crate with the junior archivist Pemmel, who was holding the corroded wire recording's transcription and shaking visibly. The way archivists shake in the presence of a primary source they have been taught is extinct. "It's the crossing song," the head laundress was saying, to Pemmel patiently, the way one explains weather to the very young. Veskama, 40 years over the mangles, arms like dock cable, a voice that came up from somewhere below the tiles. "Of course it's in the old straight tongue." The guild laundered for both delegations at the first armistice, and the straight women worked these same tables. And a folding song doesn't care whose tongue it's in, it cares that the beat lands when the cloth does. Our grandmothers learned it off the straight women the way you learn anything at a table, by being at the table. We never knew it was anyone's anthem. It's a work song. You sing it or you lose the rhythm and the linen tells on you. You have been singing a dead language, Pemmel said, unevenly. Below stairs for 60 years. Below stairs, Vescomau agreed, with a glance up through the ceiling, through 12 floors of polished beings, a glance of immense unhurried irony. Nothing dies. Things only die upstairs where they're kept too fine to use. The certification took 9 days, because the two shores' philological attachés both attempted to discredit it, each delegation having privately relied on the anthem's impossibility, and both attachés separately were invited to the laundry landing and stood in the steam listening to 4 verses, and came up the stair changed. The Corrad attaché certified the tide stops as authentic with the stiff formality of a man signing his own side's disarmament. The Racine attaché, very old, was observed to remain on the landing a long while after the singing stopped, and to touch the doorframe on her way out, the way the reef-born touch a shrine. The official entry read, Anthem, resolved singers, the atelier zone, outlay nil. In the private ledger, at midnight, Velrain wrote, Item 6 was actually impossible. It was on my desk for 9 years in 3 different folders. It was solved 60 years ago by women whose names I did not know 4 floors beneath my office, and the solution was kept alive by the fact that nobody important ever went to look at it. She asked the porters where the singing came from. The whole item. That was the whole item. Wrote, produce a singer as a joke about impossibility. And the house had been producing singers since, before I hatched, the way it produces steam, invisibly below, on schedule, unthanked. And then, because the hour was late and the drawer was locked, I begin to understand what she sees when she looks at us. She sees a building that has been lying to itself about where its load-bearing walls are. We mock her for eating with gardeners. She is eating with the foundations. Items 7 and 8 fell in the same week, the way dominoes do once the table starts shaking, and between them they cost the house its last comfortable illusion, that the human's victories required mystery. 7 was the place settings, 600 pieces of banquet silver etched by a subcontractor working from a pavilion-published style guide, with the honorific Corrad veil when the Corrad Protocol Annex specified Corrad Ka. The discovery had detonated 8 days before the banquet. The provisioner, Master Garnset, had presented a re-etching quote with a rush premium that made even the bursar's office go quiet, alongside an expression of regret so poorly fitted to his face that Velrain had noted it in the margin of her copy. Re-etch and be bled, or serve the banquet on insulting silver. The drowned folder gained its newest page. The human took the question, of all places, to the archive, to Pemmel, now permanently stationed at the landing deck's orbit, and the answer came back certified in 2 days. Corrad veil was not an error. It was the elder form, the pre-schism honorific, the address the two shores had used for the Corrad clanheads in the centuries when the strait was one water, abandoned upstairs when the war made old courtesies treasonous, preserved in boundary stone inscriptions and fairy charters, and Pemmel's memorandum noted with the dry triumph of his profession, in the engraved dedication of the atelier's own founding kettle, which had been addressing its Corrad patrons in the elder form for 300 years in the middle of the under kitchen, where nobody important ever read it. Older was deeper. To be addressed in the elder form at a peace table was not insult. It was the single deepest courtesy the silver could have carried, because it addressed both delegations from the time before the wound. The Corrad Protocol Office, consulted with appropriate ceremony, concurred so emphatically that they requested the style guide's correction be formally withdrawn. The Racine office concurred 1 hour later, both shores having now discovered the only thing more valuable than the other side's humiliation, a courtesy that cost neither of them precedence. 600 pieces of silver went from catastrophe to masterstroke without being touched by a single tool. Outlay nil. Master Garnset's rush quote returned to him, unexercised, with the keeper's compliments. Velrain signed that letter herself and permitted herself, in signing one of the season's few unmixed pleasures. She had begun, by then, to keep a separate informal file on Garnset, in whose accounts the Accord's small disasters kept finding a man already quoted, already positioned, already regretful. The file was thin, it would thicken. 8 was the robe, and 8 was the one that made the etiquette masters stop using the word luck in their commentaries, because 8 happened in front of them. The cindered envoy Corradun Vale, voice of the Ember clans, hero of the Strait War's worst night, which he had spent in a burning hull holding a boarding door shut with his own shoulder until his clan's children were away. What the fire had left of his right side was lattice now, ember steel prosthetic architecture, clan-forged, half again broader than any humanoid shoulder on the spur, junctioned in ways no tailor's pattern cast had ever catalogued. He could not be measured. Touching the envoy's body, flesh or steel, was taboo outside his clan circle. And the taboo had teeth, 60 years of them. He could not be fitted by eye. The signing robe of the Accord was the most photographed garment of the decade and would hang on him in front of every broadsheet in known space. The Accord's own clan tailors could have cut it, but the Accord's protocol, negotiated through 4 bleeding rounds, required the host guild to clothe both principals, neutrality woven and worn, and so the impossibility was by signature, the ateliers. The human came to the fitting hall with the seamster Coem, 6-fingered, silent, the atelier's finest needle and the only member of the tailoring floor who had attended the gala below the salt, and with 2 lamps, a spool of dockyard marking twine and a square of chalk. "Honor distance, envoy," she said, and stayed at it 4 full paces the whole hour. What followed was, the etiquette master's report would state, a fitting conducted without a fitting. She set the lamps low and crossed, the way freight riggers set lamps when a load's true dimensions matter more than its manifest. Velrain would learn later, from the file she should not have needed to request, that the human's first employment, at 15, had been measuring uncrated cargo at Dre's anchor by shadow, sway, and rule of 3, because customs fees were charged on declared volume and her boarding house's clients were poor and crooked in roughly equal measure, and she read the envoy's lattice off the wall in 2 thrown shadows while Coem chalked the projections. Then she asked the envoy to walk, just walk, the room's length and back, and she watched the sway of him the way she watched rooms, and called the lattice's flex points off his moving silhouette in dockhands units that Coem, fingers flying, translated into Taylor's script. 1 hour, 41 measurements, no touch, no offense, no instrument the house hadn't owned for centuries. Coem cut the robe in 3 days. Then, unasked, the seamster cut a second, identical, and hung it in the robing room's cedar shadow, and when the human raised an eyebrow at the duplicate, Coem spoke in front of witnesses the only full sentence anyone could recall from him, that season, you measure twice, I cut twice, important things should exist in 2s. The envoy stood for his viewing on the 14th day before the Accord. The robe fit the lattice the way water fits a stone. Corradune Vale, who had not been successfully clothed by an off-world hand in 60 years, regarded himself in the long glass for a slow minute, flexed the steel shoulder the cut had honored rather than hidden, and said to the room, in trade tongue, gravely, "Whoever measured me has handled cargo that mattered." It was understood by everyone present to be the highest compliment in the Ember clan's vocabulary. It was reported verbatim in 19 broadsheets. And in the pavilion of the held breath, across the spur, where the season's commentary had run for weeks on the theme of the decaying guild and its menagerie hire, Savish Drell read the 19 broadsheets and stopped finding the atelier's season funny and made, in the cold way of a man who had himself once been hazed out of that same house by a list he never spoke of, 3 appointments. The first 2 appointments emptied the atelier's perfumery and its tide office in a single morning. Master Ayel, perfumer to the house for 2 decades, composer of the scent protocols for every state occasion since the Treaty of the Verge, gone. By the 3rd bell, contract bought out at triple, already installed in the pavilion's atelier by midday, taking with her the nose that was to have balanced the Accord's air. The Racine who read still air as ambush against the Corrad, whose honor smoke had to be present but not dominant, a calibration Ayel had described, accurately, as tuning a chord between 2 species fears. Dr. Amazve, the tide mathematician, followed before the 5th bell, the quiet scholar whose tables converted the Racine moon's pull-into ceremony. The mingling of waters was lawful, in tide court eyes only at true slack, the brief turning stillness between tides, and the Accord signing window had been computed by Vey, checked by Vey, and was understood by Vey alone, because the Straits tide mathematics, 3 moons, a resonant basin, 60 years of war-wrecked baffles on the seabed, were a specialty with exactly 1 living practitioner on the spur. It was not sabotage, it was purchase, lawful as a charter instrument, conducted at prices that announced themselves as strategy, timed for the morning after the robe made the atelier look unkillable. The spur understood the message in both directions. The pavilion was reminding the galaxy that competence could be bought, and reminding the atelier that what its human kept finding below stairs, Drell could simply remove from above. The protocol floor took the news the way hulls take a pressure breach. Volraine spent the morning in triage. The scent protocols could be approximated from Ayel's filed compositions. Apprentices wept over them, but approximation might hold. And the tide tables could not be approximated by anyone, and everyone on the floor knew it. And at the noon bell, Velraine did the thing she had promised herself in the private ledger she would not do. She tested the human. She told herself afterward it had been protective, and the ledger, which had stopped accepting her memoranda voice, recorded otherwise. The pavilion's third appointment of the morning had been a courier to the landing desk, an offer of employment for N. Caro, second aide, titled employment, ranked, salaried at a figure that was not a salary but an argument, signed by Drell himself, valid until the accord's eve. Standard poaching would have routed the offer privately. Drell had routed it through the atelier's own clerk's gate, in pavilion gray, so the whole house would watch it arrive, which told Velrain the offer's true function. It was not a recruitment, it was a solvent, applied to the exact joint where the atelier's new strength met the atelier's old contempt. Let the house watch the human read it. Let the house wonder. Drell knew, none better, none in the galaxy better, what this house did to its lower stairs, and what its lower stairs eventually concluded the house deserved. Velrain carried the gray envelope to the landing desk herself. 11 years of statecraft, and the season had her playing courier on her own floor. She catalogued the irony and went anyway. At the hour the stair was busiest, because if the test was to mean anything, the house had to see it administered. From the pavilion, she said, setting it down sealed. Drell's hand. You will want to weigh it carefully. Their kettle, I'm told, is newer than ours. The human looked at the envelope. Then she looked up at Velrain, and Velrain stood in the full attention of those weather-watching eyes longer than any moment yet that season, while the lower stair pretended not to hold its breath around them. And what the human's face wore was not loyalty, and was not temptation, and was not even particularly interest. It was something Velrain took 3 further weeks to find the name for, because the name was patience, and patience was not a thing anyone had ever aimed at her before. Is there an item 12, Keeper? The human said. There are 11 items, Velrain said. There were always 11. Then I haven't finished, the human said, and slid the gray envelope, unopened, across the landing desk's scarred wood, back to Velrain's side. If the pavilion writes again, tell them I don't read other houses' mail during a commission. It harmonizes badly. The lower stair went back to work in a sudden general rustle of beings who had all simultaneously remembered urgent errands. By the evening bell, the exchange had traveled the house, verbatim, and then better than verbatim. By the next morning, it had crossed the spur. The broadsheets, who had spent a week pricing the atelier's collapse, ran the line about other houses' mail under mastheads from 6 stations, and the pavilion's triple-price perfumer, it was reliably reported, had thrown a decanter. Velrain wrote one line in the private ledger that night, and the line embarrassed her, and she kept it anyway, because the ledger had become the one room in the house where she did not curate the inventory. We bought a punchline at charter minimum, and the only being on this station who cannot be purchased is the punchline, and I no longer remember which of those 2 facts was supposed to be the joke. The week's reception fell 2 evenings later, and the season's whole strange chemistry was on display in one room for anyone with the instruments to read it. The receptions had changed. Attendance was up. Attendance had been up for a month. Nobody on the spur could afford to miss the next installment, and the recitations of the list, once the evening's reliable comedy, had become something closer to a liturgy. Guests arrived having memorized the remaining items the way one memorizes odds. A Tessic dowager, the same dowager, the witness chair, the dabbing sleeve, now held a small court by the east windows where she narrated the completed items to off-station visitors with proprietary relish, as though she had commissioned them. The Murex consul had taken to greeting Velrain with a carapace gesture she eventually had researched. It translated approximately, "Your house fights well," and was not a gesture the Murex wasted. And there were new faces at the margins of the gallery, faces the gallery was still deciding how to see. Vesca Mao stood near the service arch in her formal blacks, present at Ezeltha's written invitation, drinking the reception's wine with the unhurried air of a woman who had boiled finer vintages out of tablecloths. 2 under-gardeners flanked old Sum by the long windows. The invitations had gone out over the first curator's own seal, without explanation, because a first curator explains nothing, and the gallery had absorbed the precedent the way it absorbed everything that season, with a ripple, a recalibration, and a quiet repricing of where the floor was. Maviel chose that room, of all rooms, to try to win the season back. He did it charmingly. Because Maviel did everything charmingly, it was the whole of his portfolio. He waited for a lull with good acoustics, raised his glass toward Velrain, and observed in a voice calibrated to carry exactly as far as he wanted it to, that the house seemed poised for an unprecedented embarrassment. A hazing list 9 elevenths complete. Though I note, Keeper, that we may yet be saved. Item 11 requires our Marvel to accomplish everything unseen, and one cannot cross the concourse without hearing her name. The broadsheets have seen her. The pavilion has certainly seen her. They sent ribbons. I'd suggest the list stands failed on its final item, and the honor of the terraces stands. He turned the glass, pleased with himself, narrowly preserved. The ripple started, the old ripple, the gallery's reflex. 400 polished beings, remembering the opening night and reaching for its comfortable arrangement of the universe. Read the item? Under curator, Velrain said. She had not planned it. She heard her own registry voice go flat and cold and realized, with the strange late clarity of the whole season, that she was not defending the human. She was defending the drafting, and the distinction had stopped mattering weeks ago. You've recited it all season. Read it precisely. Maviel, wrong-footed, recited. Accomplished without the aid being seen to accomplish anything. Seen to accomplish, Velrain said. Name me the witness. The kettle was poured behind 3 locks before any of us knew there was an item to fail. We saw a cup arrive. The vessel healed in a mourner's workroom at night. We saw a crate come back. The flowers grew 41 years before she was born. We saw a table dressed. The annex was filed for by a clerk doing paperwork. The dinner was seated by a diagram. The silver was saved by an archivist's certificate. The robe was measured by lamplight from 4 paces. The salt walked through a passenger gate in the hands of 340 beings, of whom I was one, and I will tell you what I saw, because I was watching with both eyes the entire time. I saw this housework. I have yet to see her do anything. She let it stand 1 beat. The galaxy has heard of her, under curator. Hearing is not seeing. If you can produce 1 witness to the act itself, 1 being who watched the impossible performed rather than discovered it completed, bring them to my office and I will rule the item failed myself. Until then, I'd thank the terraces not to grade work they have not understood. It was, the etiquette masters agreed afterward in their dry professional way, the first recorded instance of the keeper of the calendar deploying the full registry voice in defense of the lower stair, and the gallery filed out that evening having understood the evening's actual announcement, which had nothing to do with Maviel. The institution's immune system had changed sides. The human, for the record, Selvatch's record. He had begun appending a personal annex to the reception minutes, a document Velrain suspected would outlive them both, spent the exchange at the service arch refilling Vescamau's glass, and was asked afterward by an off-station guest, breathless, whether she had heard what the keeper said, and replied audibly whether calm. I'm told it was about procedure. Most things here are. Ezil Thavan found Velrain at the reception's ebb, by the long windows, in the manner the first curator had of arriving beside a person like a change in temperature. Item 10, Eziltha said to the window. Not a question. Item 10, Velrain said, is the tides now, first curator. I'll bring you the whole of it tomorrow. You'll bring me the whole of it, Eziltha agreed, and I will say yes, and we will both conduct ourselves as though that cost nothing. The old curator watched the running lights a moment. The next thing she said in the dry, salt-adjacent tone that Velrain had begun that season to understand was what the Vaughn family had instead of weeping. 30 years I have known exactly where my sister keeps her light. It took a hazing list and a human to make the knowing usable. When this is over, keeper, remind me to review what else this house knows that it cannot use, and what exactly we have all been polishing instead, which left the tides, and item 10 standing between the house and its last impossible problem like a door nobody wanted to be first through. Because the only other being who had ever computed the straight slack by hand before tide mathematics was a doctorate, when it was still a ferry keeper's trade learned wet. The only living name in Vey's own citations that did not belong to Vey was a retired curator, who kept a ferry light on Greywater Shoal and had not answered a letter from the Atelier of the 100 Courtesies in 30 years and was the first curator's sister. Velrain discovered she had stopped thinking of item 10 as the cruel joke she had written and started thinking of it as the load-bearing wall it had apparently been all along, and the discovery sat in her like cold water because she could no longer tell. This was the season's true vertigo, worse than any single miracle off the list, whether the human had been completing Velrain's list at all, or whether Velrain, on the night she'd raided the drowned folder for 11 impossibilities to dress as comedy, had unknowingly drafted the only honest document of her career, an exact sequenced inventory of everything the Accord could not survive without. She had written the list to break a human. She had, it was becoming appallingly clear, written the summit's order of works, and the only being executing it was the one the house had hired as decoration. Item 9 resolved itself on the 13th day before the Accord in a manner the Velimport office would be explaining to its own historians for a generation. The ember salt was not seasoning. Velrain had needed this explained to her once years ago and had needed it explained to the bursar's office 4 times that season. Ember salt was the Korred's covenant mineral, mined from the mother fire vents of their homeworld, and a clan that ate another clan's ember salt at table was bound to peace with it for the duration of the meal, which made the banquets 1100 weight not catering but disarmament. the chemical foundation of every toast the Accord would raise. It sat in bond at Vellum, 9 berths down the spur, behind a port office sealed for the counting. The 40-day census of souls that Vellum's founding species conducted each cycle, during which no commercial instrument could be filed, no cargo released, no petition heard, and no exception made, the last exception having been granted 900 years ago and regretted, the port standing reply noted, ever since. The Corrid could not waive the salt. The counting could not be waived by anyone. The drowned folders page on item 9 bore annotations from 4 departments, the politest of which read, "See you in 40 days." The humans question, Selvatch had taken to transcribing her questions, having noticed that they were the only part of any miracle that happened in plain sight, was this: does the counting close the passenger gate? It did not. It could not. The counting counted souls, and souls moved, and Vellum's passenger gate therefore stood open through every counting in 9 centuries, processing travelers and their effects, each traveler entitled by the port's own founding charter to carry through, uninspected and untaxed, one sealed parcel of personal weight, a pilgrim's allowance, older than the bond house, older than the guilds, written when the port was a shrine pier and never repealed, because repealing a pilgrim right at a shrine pier was the kind of act that got remembered. 1,100 weight of ember salt, the human observed, divided into parcels of personal weight, came to 326 parcels. The atelier of the 100 courtesies employed, across its floors and stairs and kitchens and docks and gardens, rather more than 326 souls. And the Corrid bondmaster at Vellum, once the proposal had been conveyed to him through the clan uncle quartermaster over smoked tea at the gardener's bothy, declared that the covenant mineral could lawfully be repacked at the bond house door into clan-sealed pilgrim parcels, there being in all the annals of the mother fire no precedent against it, precedent requiring that anyone had ever before been mad enough to try. What the spur watched on the 13th day was the atelier walk its own freight. They went by the morning ferries in their off-shift clothes, porters and laundresses and gardeners and under-cooks and clerks and seamsters, and, after a memorandum from the keeper's office that Velrain drafted at midnight and rewrote 4 times so that the staff would understand attendance was voluntary, would understand it was historic, and would above all understand it was wanted, a remarkable number of the upper floors as well. Archivists, etiquette masters, 2 under-curators, Mayville in a dock coat that had plainly never met a dock and that he wore thereafter at every reception of the season. 340 souls of the atelier passed through Vellum's passenger gate in good order, each bearing 1 sealed parcel of personal weight, each parcel stamped with the pilgrim's allowance by counting clerks who, this was the detail the broadsheets could not leave alone, came out from behind their wickets to watch the column pass, because 900 years of countings had never once sent the port a procession. It was Vescamau who began the crossing song at the gate, for rhythm, because a column carries best on a 4-beat, and so the Accord's covenant salt came up the spur to the atelier's doors on the shoulders of its own house, to the anthem of the straits sung in a tongue 60 years dead, and the broadsheets that had spent a season inventing names for the guild's decline ran out of irony all at once. The eldest etiquette master, watching the column come up the concourse from the 100 doors, was heard to say, and declined ever after to deny having said, in 400 years this house has staged the galaxy's processions. That is the first one we have ever been. Outlay, ferry fares, 343rd class. Volraine carried her own parcel. She had intended to supervise from the concourse. She had drafted herself a supervisory role in the memorandum's margins. And at the bond house door, a hired under-laundress whose name she did not know had simply handed her a sealed parcel, assuming, the assumption was the whole event, that the keeper of the calendar was there to carry. The salt was heavier than its weight. She walked it the full 9 berths with her collar-locked slate and her hands learning what the house's hands learned every day, and somewhere around the 6th berth she identified, with the cold private accuracy of the ledger, the emotion she had been declining to name all season. It was not humiliation. The gallery had been wrong about that from the first night, and so had she. It was relief, the relief of a structure asked at last to bear weight in the direction it was built. 10 items had been read aloud at the lantern ledger. 9 were done in plain sight, done at charter minimum, done in ways that had cost the house nothing and taught it everything, done so publicly that the gallery's recitations had reversed their key, the joke now told from the bottom of the list upward, the laughter now aimed, fondly, terribly, at the departments who had drowned each item first. 1 remained. Velrain took item 10 to the first curator herself, because there were things even this season could not make her delegate. Ezelthavan received her in the north study at the dimming hour, among the season's correspondence, and listened without movement to a report Velrain had rehearsed past the point of honesty and delivered anyway, that the tide tables had gone to the pavilion with Dr. Vey, that the mingling of waters was lawful only at true slack, that the slack of the Accord's appointed day could be computed, on all the spur, by one retired ferry keeper on Greywater Shoal, and that the ferry keeper's attendance happened, by an administrative coincidence the keeper would regret to her last molt, to be item 10 of a document the entire galaxy had spent a season memorizing. "You are asking my leave," Ezel said, when the silence had aged, "to send the human after my sister." "I am asking your leave," Velrain said, "to send the human after the tides." "The sister is who the tides answer to." Ezel rose and stood at the study's long window, where the station's running lights made their slow-scheduled constellations, and Velrain watched the oldest back in the guild hold itself straight, and understood that she was being permitted to watch, and that the permission was itself the answer arriving. 30 years, the first curator said. "This house has told itself my sister left over a quarrel between sisters, because a quarrel between sisters requires nothing of the house. Hear the true ledger once, keeper, since this is the season for true ledgers. Aloth left because she said this guild had begun mistaking polish for courtesy, and that polish is what courtesy becomes when you stop meaning it, and that an institution which laughs at its own lower stairs would one day find its lower stairs were the only part of it still bearing load. She said it to the assembled curators, at the lantern ledger, at the reading of a list. I laughed with the gallery. I was new to the first chair, the house was watching, and I laughed, and my sister looked at me the way one looks at a cracked vessel, and took the morning ferry, and the house has called it a quarrel between sisters for 30 years because the alternative was to call it a verdict." She turned from the window. "Send the human. And keep her when she goes. Tell her this house does not require my sister to forgive me. It only asks her to come watch what the lower stair has done with the place." Velrain delivered the message whole at the landing desk, with the queue politely pretending deafness around them. The human listened, wrote nothing down. Velrain had learned by then what it meant when the human wrote a thing down, and what it meant when she didn't, and asked one question only: "What does she like, keeper?" Not what she's owed, what she likes. Vel consulted 30 years of institutional memory. The chair retired in her honor, the protocols she had authored, the portrait in the long gallery the sitter had never seen. Then she consulted, with more difficulty, the older stratum beneath, gossip from her own 8 years, dead seasons, the atelier's sediment. "Fairies," she said at last, and heard the strangeness of it as she said it. Before she was a curator, she was a straight-fare purser's daughter. The whole guild knew at once. We made it a marvel, risen so far, all that. I suspect the marveling was one more thing she left. A pause. The sediment kept yielding, quern bread, the dark kind, dockside, with the burnt rind. There was a standing joke that no banquet of hers ever lacked it, hidden somewhere on the service tables for the staff, and ledgers kept honestly. She used to say it in committee like a blessing over the books. An honest ledger is a love letter to whoever inherits it. "Fairies, dark bread, honest ledgers," the human said, in the tone of a person securing cargo. "Thank you, keeper. I'll need 6 days and a third-class fare." "Take the guild packet. It's faster." "And it's the guild's," the human said. She left the guild. "I'd rather arrive as a passenger than as a summons." She was already folding her one bag. The queue watched her do it with an attention previously reserved for state funerals, and at the stairhead she paused and looked back at Velrain with something that, on any face less weather-calm, might have been mischief. "Item 10 doesn't say persuaded, keeper. It says attend and sit the witness chair. You drafted it cleanly. I always thought that was the kindest thing about the list. There's no item that says make them love us. Just do the thing. The thing can be done." Then she was down the stair and gone on the morning ferry, 3rd class, and the atelier of the 100 courtesies discovered, with 6 days and the galaxy's summit remaining, what it had become in one season, a house with its keystone on leave. The landing desk queue did not disband, it pooled. The station warden's liaison queries went unanswered for a day, then were answered by committee, then were answered wrongly, and the warden's commandant appeared in person on the protocol floor asking, with parade ground courtesy, whether the desk would be staffed again soon. The Chord quartermaster took his tea at the bothy alone and was reported melancholy. Selvach instituted a holding ledger for matters awaiting the human, and then, on the 2nd day, with the expression of a being amputating his own precedence, began working the queue himself, at the landing desk, in person, because, he informed the senior table, flatly daring contradiction, the desk has standing now. Someone must keep it warm, or the standing lapses. By the 4th day, 2 etiquette masters were taking shifts beside him. The gallery came down to watch the spectacle of the upper floors learning the lower stairs trade, and stayed, in several recorded cases, to hold a place in the queue. Velrain wrote in the private ledger, The house has begun performing her in her absence, the way a crew sails the captain's habits through a storm. Note for the historian, since I appear to be becoming one, nobody ordered this. The institution is learning the way she learned, by being at the table, and beneath it, the entry she sat with longest. Drell bought our perfumer and our mathematician, and proved competence can be purchased. She took a third-class ferry and proved it can also be taught, which is the one thing purchase can never do. And if the pavilion has not yet understood the difference, this house spent 60 years not understanding it either, so we may extend our rival a little patience. The dispatches from Greywater Shoal, when they came, were not from the human at all. They were from the Shoal's harbor postmistress who, it emerged, conducted a brisk trade in observed gossip with 3 stations broadsheets, and whose wire reports, devoured on the spur with an appetite the Accord itself could not command, sketched the 6 days in marginalia. A human off the morning ferry, third class with 1 bag, who did not walk up the lightkeeper's path at all but took a room over the ferry house and a half share of work at the slip. No questions asked, none answered. A broken davit on the evening boat mended by hand before the keeper had finished. Being told about it. A ferry house ledger, 40 years of a retired curator's scrupulous columns, found one morning with its single error. A fare miscarried across a page turn 11 years back. The kind of ghost that haunts an honest bookkeeper down decades. Located, documented, and corrected in a respectful stranger's hand, with a note citing the page, the cause, and an apology for presumption. Dark cornbread, dockside, burnt rind, appearing at the slip house table without comment. And on the 4th evening, the postmistress reported, the lightkeeper of Greywater Shoal had been seen doing what she had not been seen doing in 30 years of retirement, sitting on her own pier past the dimming hour talking to a passenger. What was said on the pier no dispatch carried. Belrain assembled it afterward, the way she assembled everything that season, from freight. From the things Aloth Vaughn said later, on the spur, in rooms where Belrain was present and required to keep her collar slate. This much became known, that the human had not once in 6 days asked her to come. That on the 5th morning Aloth had asked the human directly, being a purser's daughter, and constitutionally unable to leave a fare unstated, what exactly the atelier had sent her to obtain, and the human had taken out, of all the documents on the spur, the list. The list itself, the cream sheet, the green wax, 400 chandeliers worth of laughter pressed into 11 items, and had handed it across the slip-house table and said, Item 10, 6th line. I'd rather you read what was actually written than what I'd tell you it says. And Aloth Vaughn had read the 11 courtesies of the season in silence, twice, and then had begun, the postmistress's wire reported, to laugh, not the gallery's laughter, the other kind, the kind that has salt in it, and had said, when she could speak, Item 10 is always the cruel one. I wrote that rule. She said the rest in the atelier's own vestibule, 6 days later by the drain pool, in travel clothes, with the human standing off at honor distance, and half the house finding reasons to pass through the vestibule, and the first curator not yet sent for, because the traveler had asked for a moment first. She stood looking around the hall she had walked out of 30 years before, at the 100 doors, at the gallery rails above where faces gathered like weather, and she delivered her finding to the room at large, an arbiter to her marrow. I sat where you all sit. I wrote lists like this one, wrote the rule that shaped them. 11 items impossible by design, because the house must teach its aides the size of the house. I told myself it was a curriculum. So did the chief of staff who wrote mine, and the one who wrote hers, all the way back down the stairs of this guild like a debt being handed down, every generation paying it to the next because it had been paid to them. I broke an aide with one of mine in my season, a gifted one. He sat 4 nights with my 11 impossibilities, and on the 5th morning he resigned, and the gallery laughed, and I let it, and that aide crossed the spur and built a house of his own with our cruelty for a cornerstone. And you have all spent this season learning his handwriting, because his name is Savish Drell. The vestibule had gone very quiet. So when the wire reached the shoal that the atelier was reading its hazing aloud at the lantern ledger again, I confess I kept the kettle hot for the resignation. 30 years and the house still paying its debt downward the way it always had. She looked, then at the human, and the salt lauder came back up in her voice. And instead, item by item, some child off a freight dock has been standing at the bottom of our beautiful terraced cruelty, catching it and handing it back up as competence. She did not break, and she did not leave. And attend to this part, all of you, because I have sat 30 years on a shoal thinking about this house and never once predicted it. She did not learn the lesson the list teaches. She is 4 items from finishing the thing, and she has not once made any of you feel the size of her. The debt stops at her desk. She received it and is not passing it on. In 40 years of curacy, I call that impossible, and I have come a long way at my age, 3rd class, to sit in a witness chair and be wrong about it. She paused, purser's daughter, and let the silence pay its fare. The tides? Since the keeper is standing there with her collar locked and her calendar bleeding. Yes, I'll compute your slack. I computed it for the first armistice, with a wet rope and a counting frame, before any of Vay's beautiful mathematics. The straight and I are old correspondents. Item 10 attends and sits the chair. And then, mildly, to the room's held breath, with 30 years of distance folded into 4 words, where is my sister? What passed between the Von sisters passed behind the North Study's door and stayed there. The house, denied the scene, fed for days on its single witnessed instant. Ezeltha Von coming down the great stair faster than dignity, stopping 1 step above the floor as though the last step were 30 years deep. And Aloth looking up at her and saying, dry as the counting, your pool's been drained. Improvement, and the first curator of the Atelier of the 100 Courtesies laughing, in public, with salt in it, and taking the last step. Velrain got the rest where she had learned that season to get everything, below. Off the night porter who carried the study's tea, reported to the landing desk, to the desk, the address mattered now, that the sisters had talked until the lamps were renewed twice, that there had been one long silence of the kind door's respect, and that when he cleared the service at dawn the 2 cups had been side by side on one tray, which, he said with a porter's precision about what objects confess, is not where 2 beings sit who are still quarreling. The spur had 4 days to enjoy its season of marvels. Then the Accord's Eve arrived, the delegations landed in full. The 100 doors opened on the summit the galaxy had waited 60 years to watch, and Savish Drell, who had been buying, placing, and timing all season while the broadsheets watched the human, began, with great patience and from several directions at once, to take the atelier's miracle apart. The first blow landed at the 7th bell of the eve, dressed as paperwork. The Spur's Registry of Tongues, the licensing body whose stamp made an interpreter diplomatic rather than decorative, issued a notice suspending the credentials of the Accord's certified shore-speak interpreter, pending review of irregularities in the chain of attestation. The interpreter in question was Pemmel, the junior archivist, certified jointly by both delegations' philological attachés after the laundry. Landing, the named irregularity was that his attestation derived from an uncatalogued oral source, the laundresses of undetermined provenance. The notice was charter clean, procedurally perfect, and signed by a deputy registrar who had dined twice that season. The thin Garnset file in Velrain's drawer happened to record, at the pavilion's table. Review period, 10 days, the Accord signed in 1. Velrain read the notice on the protocol floor with the senior table around her, and the cold coming up her spine in the old familiar way, and she had her mouth open to begin the counterattack. Registrar's conflicts, emergency petition, the attaché resummoned when she heard, from the direction of the landing desk, the question that had become the house's load-bearing grammar. Does the right require an interpreter? The human asked, or does it require the language? The protocol of the mingling, consulted, required the anthem sung and the witness's charge spoken in Old Shore speak. It did not require translation. Translation was a courtesy for the audience. And the audience, as of the laundry landing, included 2 philological attachés who had certified the tongue, a delegation apiece who had specified it, and sitting the witness chair itself, a retired arbiter who had spoken straight pidgin before she could write, whose attestation as a primary speaker predated the Registry of Tongues' own founding charter, and was therefore, Pemmel found the clause at midnight, hands still shaking, this time not entirely from awe, exempt from its review powers entirely. The registry could suspend a certificate. It could not suspend a native. File the acknowledgement, Velrain instructed. Thank the deputy registrar for his diligence, and copy the pavilion for harmonization. It was the first time in 11 years she had heard the senior table laugh at something she said, and the first time she had ever permitted herself to enjoy it. The second blow came in the night, beautifully wrapped. 12 ceremonial fountains, a gift to the summit from the pavilion of the held breath, that the air of so historic a chamber be graced with the music of moving water, delivered to the dock at the 8th bell with full provenance, full courtesy, and a publicity wire already filed, so that refusing the gift outright would hand the pavilion a grievance to dine on for a season. Self-contained, exquisite, and engineered, every one of them, around still reservoir basins, standing water, the ambush fear, the one thing the Racine Security Annex forbade in any chamber the Tide Mother entered, accept and desecrate the summit, refuse and insult a sibling guild on the galaxy's brightest morning. The gift was a fork, and Drell had built it with the patience of a man who had been planning this banquet longer than his rivals had. The gardeners got it instead. Old Sum walked around the 12 fountains twice, kicked one base panel gently the way one greets a horse, and observed to the human, who had come down to the dock in the middle of the night with tea, because of course she had, that a reservoir is only standing water if you let it stand. The atelier's roof had been running brine through coolant outfall channels for 41 years. Its gardeners knew gravity-fed flow the way the laundresses knew rhythm. By dawn, the 12 fountains stood in the great vestibule, plumbed in series into a single circulating run, drawn from the building's own water main. Returning to it, never pooling, the reservoir basins converted to weirs with bronze spillway lips, the seamster's floor cut and polished in hours because Coam woke half his hall to do it, and the Racine security attaché walked through at first light with instruments, certified the entire installation as flowing water, treaty grade, no exceptions noted, and asked, in writing, for the modification schematics, as the tide courts have not previously encountered fountains that defer. The pavilion's publicity wire ran as filed. The broadsheets ran it beside the Racine attaché's letter. On the spur, where every reader could do the arithmetic, the gift's two prongs had been bent, overnight, into a third shape nobody had planned. The morning's first story was the host guild improving the rivals present until both houses looked gracious, which made the atelier look serene and the pavilion look like its junior partner, and there was nothing in it anywhere for Drell to file a grievance against except a compliment. The third blow was not paperwork, and it was not wrapped. At dawn of the signing day, the duty steward of the robing room found the cindered envoy's robe on its cedar stand with its right shoulder, the steel honoring shoulder, the cut the 19 broadsheets had photographed, slashed through in 3 strokes, cleanly, by a blade and a hand that had known exactly what the cut would cost and exactly how few hours remained to recut it. No alarm had sounded. The robing room's lock had been opened with a key, and the keyboard's ledger showed the key drawn overnight by a porter's mark that the night porters queried did not recognize as any of their own. Vilrain stood in the robing room in the gray of dawn, looking at the wound. There was no other word. The room felt like a surgery, with the steward weeping behind her in the summit 9 hours out, and she was already drafting the catastrophe in her head, the apology to the Ember clans. The envoy robed in his own clan cut after all. The protocol breach detonating the neutrality clause, 4 bleeding rounds of negotiation undone by 3 strokes of a blade. When Coam came past, her without a word, lifted the ruined robe off its stand, hung the second robe in its place, squared the steel honoring shoulder with 2 fingers, and stood back. You measure twice, the seamster said, to the room, to the season, to whoever had held the blade. I cut twice. Important things should exist in twos. The robing room steward stopped weeping. Vilrain looked at the duplicate hanging where the catastrophe had been, fit, pressed, waiting, 3 days old, made for no reason the burzer's office would ever have approved in advance, and made the only ruling the morning required. Nobody tells the Ember clans there were 2. The envoy wears the robe that was always going to be his. And then to Coam, the words coming up from somewhere below her training, your floor will never again have its requisitions questioned by my office. Not for thread, not for cedar, not for anything. The blade itself and the false porter's mark went into the thickening file, because by mid-morning the file had thickened decisively. The vessel did it. The mingling vessel, Holland's heeled basin, traveled from the conservation vault to the signing chamber at the 10th bell under double escort, and it was Oth who carried it, because the human had asked the protocol office one of her questions, who has carried it before, and amended the escort roster so that the bearer at every stage was the porter who had carried the vessel twice already, on its arrival and its return from the Stonewrights Row, the porter whose stone hands had held its weight for a combined 11 minutes of his 40 years of carrying things for beings who never looked at him. Halfway down the processional corridor, at the changeover point where the vault escort handed off to the chamber escort, a conservation under clerk in correct livery presented correct papers in a padded crate for the final stage, as documented, and Oth, taking the crated vessel from the underclerk's trolley, stood still. This is wrong, he said. The papers were checked. Correct. The seals, correct. The crate's exterior, correct. The weight is wrong, Oth said, with the unbudgeable courtesy of a being who had spent 4 decades being process and knew exactly how much process weighed. Light. 200 grains, more. I carried her twice. And he set the crate down in the middle of the processional corridor and declined, with apologies, to carry it 1 step toward the tide mother of the Racine, and stood there, stone, while the escort commander's certainty broke against him, and somebody finally ran for the lensmaster. Inside the correct crate, under the correct seals, sat a vessel that was correct to the eye in every stroke, and was not Holland's, a copy, masterly, weeks in the making, identical down to the wave pattern of the heeled rim, betrayed by nothing but mass, because the forger had matched the look of the reef stone, and could not, on the spur, have matched the quarry. The true vessel was found within the hour, crated as conservation surplus in a dock queue for a freight run whose manifest routed. The file now was not thin at all. Through a bonded warehouse leased, behind two shelves, by the provisioning concern of Master Garnset. They took the season apart in an afternoon, Velrain and the warden's commandant together, while the summit dressed itself around them. The key drawn on a false porter's mark, cut by a locksmith Garnset's accounts, had paid for inventory services. The underclerk's livery drawn from a costumier the same accounts had paid the same week. The rush re-etch quote positioned before the silver's error was discovered because the style guide that caused the error had passed through Garnset's office on its way to the subcontractor. And behind it all, layered in retainers and harmonized courtesies, the gray patience of the pavilion, never once touching anything directly, never once needing to, a man already bitter, already positioned, already regretful, requiring only to be kept warm. Garnset, confronted in his counting room among his beautiful unexercised quotes, confessed with the speed of a man who had been rehearsing his grievances so long he was grateful for the audience, and named the pavilion's intermediary, and was escorted from the atelier of the 100 courtesies through the service dock at Velrain's specific instruction, not, as the gallery assumed, to spare the house the scandal of the 100 doors, but because Velrain had learned that season where the house's true doors were, and wanted its truest one to be the last thing he saw. She permitted herself 10 minutes of cold satisfaction, and then the last blow landed, and it landed exactly where Drell had always been aiming, in the one place all the season's miracles stood on one another's shoulders, the water itself. The order of ceremony, the summit's master document, printed overnight in 300 copies distributed at noon to both delegations, the witness, the broadsheets, and every protocol officer on the floor, gave the moment of the mingling of waters, the true slack of the strait as observed at the court chamber's meridian at the 14th bell and 40 minutes. The number had arrived through the correct channel, filed by the Spurs Office of Almanac, over the seal of its consultide mathematician of record, Dr. Amasvi, whose contract of record every protocol officer knew and none could act upon, now resided at the pavilion of the held breath. The filing was lawful, the seal was genuine. The channel was the channel the atelier itself had built into the Accord's documentation requirements in rounds negotiated when Vey had still been the house's own. And Aleph Von, sitting in the witness room with a counting frame and 40 years of correspondence with the Strait, had computed the slack at the 14th bell and 29 minutes, 11 minutes. On any document in any other season, a rounding quibble. Here, the difference between a mingling poured at true slack, lawful, sacred, binding, and a mingling poured 11 minutes after the turn into water already moving, which in tide court law was not a peace at all but its precise opposite, the old curse form, the poured insult. The thing two Racine dynasties had gone to war over before the Strait War was a rumor. If the waters mingled at Vey's published minute, the Tide Mother's own courts could lawfully void the accord within the cycle, would be handed, gift-wrapped, over a genuine seal, the omen they would need. Nobody on the floor doubted any longer how Dr. Vey's 11 minutes had come to be 11 minutes. Proving it, in the 4 hours remaining, was impossible. The mathematics had one living practitioner of record, and the pavilion held his contract, which is how the season arrived at the moment the broadsheets would not stop reprinting for a generation. The protocol floor of the atelier of the 100 courtesies, 4 hours before the Galaxy Summit, the senior table assembled, both delegations' liaisons standing in the doorway with the misprinted or correctly printed. That was the whole war. Order of ceremony in their hands, and every face on the floor turned toward Velrain Ostrov, keeper of the calendar, in whose office the choice could not be delegated, deferred, or dressed as anything but what it was. On one side, the Office of Almanac, the seal of record, the credentialed mathematics, the lawful channel, the institutional answer, everything Velrain had been, every certainty she had administered for 11 years, every terrace of the world as the Lantern Hall had laughed at it on the opening night of the season. On the other, a counting frame, a retired ferry keeper, and a sheet of straight work annotated in a small disciplined hand that the entire house now recognized at sight. The human's hand, because the human had spent the voyage back from Greywater Shoal, 3rd class, 6 days, learning the hand computation from Aleph Von at a slip house table, checking the old arbiter's framework line by line against the harbor's own. Water and the sheet on the table was their joint reckoning. The Strait's 3 moons, the basin's resonance, the war-wrecked baffles, the 11 minutes, carried by hand, signed by both. Velrain looked at the 2 numbers for what the witnesses present agreed was no more than a breath. Then she did the thing for which, more than the list, more than the season, more than any single miracle off the lower stair, the Spur would remember her. She picked up the human sheet, held it up before the senior table, the liaisons, the doorway, the house, and ruled, in the flat registry voice that had read 11 items to the chandeliers. The atelier stages its mingling at 1429 on the reckoning of the witness Aelith Von and Adid Caro of this house. Reprint the order, all 300. The Office of Almanac may file its objection with my office tomorrow when one of us has been proven wrong in front of the galaxy, and I will tell you now which of us it will not be. It will not be the fairy keeper, and it will not be the human. Because I have spent one entire season checking their work, and the work has never once been wrong, and the seal of record has never once been at the table. And the atelier of the 100 courtesies watched the candor come up its keeper's collar in front of everyone, the slate breaking open into the deep verdant flush of a Vessery staking everything she was on something she could not do herself, and watched her not turn away and not cover it, and understood before the galaxy did what the season had actually been about. The house reprinted 300 documents in 2.5 hours. The laundry presses helped. The accord of the two shores convened at the 13th bell, and for 50 minutes it was the summit the galaxy had ordered. The 100 doors standing open, the vestibule fountains running their deferential water, the tide mother of the Racine entering over tide glass with her court like weather coming ashore, the cindered envoy opposite her in the robe that honored the steel, the mother fire burning lawfully on the promenade where the station wardens had, finally, numbly, permitted it, the salt blossom breathing down the spine of the signing table, 600 pieces of silver addressing everyone present from the time before the wound. The broadsheet's image rigs drank it in tier on tier. In the gallery, the polished beings of the spur stood shoulder to shoulder with, here and there, in good coats, gardeners. Volraine ran the floor from the keeper's mark, earpiece live, and found her own calendar almost eerily quiet, the season's last miracle. A summit whose impossibilities had all been retired in advance, item by a list that had been read aloud as a joke to 400 witnesses 50 days before. There remained exactly one moment of unscheduled history, and the tide mother of the Racine supplied it at 14:11, 18 minutes before slack, in front of everything. She stopped the ceremony. The Racine do not raise their voices, the reef raises them. The tide mother lifted one webbed hand at the threshold of the mingling and the chambers. Sound died in rings outward from her, and into the silence she said, in trade tongue formally, that the tide courts had come prepared to sign, and would not pour, not yet. 60 years of war had taught her shore the cost of words on paper, she said. Her grandmother had signed papers. The strait was full of papers. The tide courts would mingle waters only as their oldest law allowed. In the presence of a living witness of the last time the two shores had kept faith, a witness of the first armistice, who had stood in the old peace with her own body and could attest that such a thing had existed, that it was not a story, that water once held still between them and held. Produce such a witness, the tide mother said, or we sign your paper, and take our tides home unmingled, and you may call that what you like. It had not been on any agenda. It had not been in any annex. It was the oldest trap of the strait, the demand for the impossible attendance, the impossibility both shores had relied on for 60 years, since every soul who stood at the first armistice was 60 years dead, and both delegations knew it, and Velraine, watching from the keeper's mark, with her heart going like the laundry presses, understood in one vertiginous breath that the tide mother knew it too, knew exactly what she was asking it because some last current in the tide courts needed the accord to fail honorably, and understood, in the same breath, the only other thing on the floor of any relevance whatsoever. Item 10. Curator Nemerita Eilioth Von will attend the accord and sit the witness chair. She had written it to wound a first curator. She had written 50 days early, in green wax as a joke, the answer to a trap nobody alive could have foreseen, because the drowned folder had known what the summit needed better than the summit knew itself. And the folder's 11 impossibilities had been, all season, the accord's own survival instinct, filed where nobody important would look. Eilioth Von rose from the witness chair. She crossed the chamber floor with a ferry keeper's unhurried walk, the purser's daughter who had stood at the first armistice as a girl of 19, in her father's crew, mooring the delegation's busboats. It was in the armistice rolls. The wardens had verified it that morning as routine accreditation deckhand Von A, and nobody had thought the line historic because nobody had thought of the line at all. And she stopped before the tide mother of the Racine at honor distance and spoke in old shore speak natively with the tide stops in it, the first time the strait's own working tongue had been heard at a treaty table in 60 years. What she said was short. Pemmel, certified or not, translated it for the protocol record in the only translation the season deserved. I held the rope the last time you're shore and has kept faith. The rope held. I am old and I came third class and I attest it. The still water existed. I touched it, pour. And the tide mother of the Racine, who had asked for the impossible in the reasonable certainty of receiving it, looked for a long moment at the impossible standing in front of her in travel-worn formal dress, and then did the thing that made the image the era's image, reprinted past all counting. She bowed her court's deepest water bow to a retired ferry keeper and stood aside from the vessel. The laundresses of the Atelier of the 100 Courtesies sang the crossing anthem at 1426, 40 strong under the dome where their pitches bloomed, in the dead language that had never died below stairs, and the chamber heard rank in it, whether the chamber's ears ran to volume or to pitch, because the diagonal had been set and the stand placed at the dead spot in the architecture, for once in 90 years, slandered no one. At 1429 and no seconds, on the reckoning of a counting frame and a small disciplined hand, the waters of the two shores went into Holland's heeled vessel together, and the Strait, 11 minutes ahead of the seal of record, stood still to receive them. True slack. The instruments confirmed it within the hour. The Office of Almanac filed no objection, then filed a personnel notice. Dr. Amesvay's contract, the broadsheets reported, was quietly not renewed, the pavilion having discovered that a mathematician who would sell 11 minutes once could not be priced for what he might sell twice. The Accord of the Two Shores was signed at 1451. The cindered envoy signed with the steel hand, which the protocol had not dared specify, and the clans took as the day's great gesture. The Tide Mother signed in reef script, and beneath her titles, in small straight pigeon letters, the broadsheets needed Pemmel to identify one word. Ferrywoman's daughter, in the old spelling, the spelling from before the wound. 60 years of war ended on the floor of the Atelier of the 100 Courtesies, between the 14th bell and the 15th, and not one thing went wrong. The galaxy never knew how many things had already gone wrong that morning, and been caught, by a porter's hands, a seamster's doubled cut, a gardener's wares, a laundry's memory, a ferry keeper's frame, a keeper's broken open collar, because catching things invisibly was the house's whole art, and the house had finally remembered which of its floors the art lived on. Item 11, the protocol record would eventually note, was thereby also complete. Not one broadsheet of the hundreds that filed that day carried the human's name. The wires credited the Atelier, the Sisters Vaughan, the Tide Mother's bow, the anthem, the robe. The season's gossip columns had spent themselves on the punchline weeks ago, and the summit gave them grander material. She had done all of it without being seen to do anything exactly as instructed, and Velrain stood in the emptying signing chamber that evening with the completed list in her hand. She had carried it all day, in her document case, like a charm or a confession, and found that item 11, her own elegant cruelty, her flourish, was the one she could no longer stomach. The gallery wanted a ceremony, of course. The house had won. Houses that win want rituals. Within 3 days, the senior table had voted the human a commendation, and the form it took was so perfectly, fatally characteristic of the institution that Velrain, presented with the draft, laughed alone in her office until her collar ran 3 colors. They proposed to name her aide of distinction of the lower stair, with a ribbon, a stipend, and a seat, decorative, voteless, honorary, at the foot of the gallery's 3rd terrace, a terrace. They had watched her carry their house across a season on her back, and the highest honor the institutional imagination could assemble was a slightly better step to stand on. The presentation was set for the closing ledger, the season-ending gala, same hall, same chandeliers, same 400 polished witnesses, 53 days after the laughter. Velrain read the citation aloud from the dais because the keeper of the calendar read citations. That was the office. She heard her own registry voice doing it and hated the voice for the first time in her life. The human came up the hall to receive the ribbon, issued uniform, hands folded, weather calm, and the gallery applauded in the antique style, palm against shoulder, warmly at length, applause with relief in it, applause with no idea what else to offer. And then the human, ribbon in hand, asked the dais. Correct depth of bow, correct form of address, in a voice that carried no further than it had to, which by now meant the entire hall held its breath to listen, whether, the season's list being complete, a second aide of the lower stair might be permitted to submit a list of her own. Velrain Ostrovmal looked down at her from the dais for one lantern flicker, said the house is listening, it had 11 items. Of course it had 11 items. She read them herself from a single sheet in the flat tones of a duty roster, and the Lantern Hall learned what the bottom of its terraces had been worth all along. That the Charter of Open Services Service Schedule, the Appendix, the Volunteer Clause, the document that had poured the season's first cup, be printed where staff could read it, in every tongue the house employed. That the laundry of the atelier be entered on the guild rolls as the choir of the house, with the standing and the wage of a protocol department, retroactive to the first armistice, since the work has been continuous. That the night porter's observations be given a ledger of record and a seat at the security briefings weight being evidence, that the gardener's bothy be granted commissary standing, its tea provisioned by the bursar, as more diplomacy happens there than in the East Gallery. That comeuppance floor requisition its own materials without counter-signature. That the duty of carrying the curator's tray never again stand unfilled, and never again be the only line on the roster anyone could have signed. That the mourner's chandlery's lamp oil be subsidized by the house in perpetuity. That Pemmel's certification be entered permanent, registry of tongues notwithstanding. That the house's orientation papers state on the first page in large script. Most things are in the appendices. That the Title 8 of distinction be abolished. The hall made a sound at that one, and its stipend folded into the lower stairs common wage. And item 11, the human said, and looked up from the sheet. And for the first time in 53 days she looked directly at Velrain in front. Of the entire gallery, that the next list of courtesies written in this house be written for the house. The aides were never the ones who needed to learn its size. The silence under the chandeliers had a long, careful architecture to it, like the silence after a keystone goes in. Then first curator Isolde Van rose from the north end of the dais, 90 years old, silver to the eyes, with her sister seated beside her where a chair had stood empty for 30 years, and said simply, "The house so moves," and 400 of the most polished beings in known space discovered that the antique applause, done with full sincerity, palm against shoulder, altogether sounds remarkably like a tide coming in. Velrain signed all 11 into standing order that night. Then she sat alone in her office with the season's 2 lists side by side on the desk, the cream sheet with the green wax, and the duty roster sheet in the small disciplined hand, and she took out her pen, and on the original 11 courtesies, beneath item 11, where 53 days ago she had written a welcome that was a sentence of exile, she added 1 line in her own formal script, and initialed it, and walked down through the sleeping house, and posted the amended list on the landing desk board where the queue would find it at first bell. Item 12, stay. There was a marginal note beneath it, in the keeper's hand, smaller, which the entire spur had quoted by the following evening, and which the Atelier's archivists, 2 centuries later, would still keep under glass. The house has reviewed the season and finds items 1 through 11 were completed by the aide. Item 12 is the house's to complete, and the house has learned at last, from whom one learns how impossible things are done. It intends to show up every day until it is finished. She was at the under-kitchen door before dawn. The kettle's 3 locks took her longer than they would have taken the duty steward. The charter, when she consulted it, was perfectly clear that the keeper of the calendar was an officer of the house in good standing, entitled to volunteer for any unclaimed duty, and the first bell tray service to the landing desk was a duty she had created by standing order at midnight. So it was, for 9 more minutes, gloriously unclaimed. She drew the first steam herself, scalding her thumb, learning what the house's hands learned. She carried the black lacquer tray with the river gold rim up the service stair past the laundry landing, where the early shift was already singing the crossing song, fold on the strong beat, and the singing did not pause as she passed, but it did. She would have sworn before any tribunal of etiquette masters, acquire a brief, unmistakable note of amusement. The human was at the landing desk, of course, for first bell, working through a stack of the warden's winter liaison queries, because the season was over, and the next one was therefore beginning. She looked up at the keeper of the calendar of the Atelier of the 100, courtesy standing over her with a tray, steam rising off the founding draft in a thin, unhurried line, collar unlocked, verdant to the jaw, holding the cup out with both hands in the manner of the lower stair. Nia Caro considered the cup. Then she took it, and held it, and the steam stood between them in the lamplight of the landing, while above their heads the house began to wake on. Schedule, the way everything in the atelier woke on schedule, except once a season, if the season was lucky, its heart. Item 12. The human said and tried the first steam and nodded once, weather calm, at the keeper, at the stair, at the whole impossible house. "You're early." "Yes," said Velrain. It came out very well for a figure of speech.